Hi there, and welcome to another episode where I have to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. In this episode, we do talk about tragedy and loss and suicide. So, if these topics are triggering for you and they're not something that you're comfortable hearing, then please feel free to skip this episode and listen to another conversations that feel more aligned with you. But if you're willing to dive into some deeper topics, then join us on this wonderful, inspiring, deeply vulnerable conversation with Laurel O'Sullivan, who is a grief guide and advocate, and as well as a certified grief educator. So she talks a little bit about her journey of discovering this new path of all the traumas and losses that she has been through in her life to really embark on this new chapter, as she says, of being a grief guide. And we talk about the importance of grief and the methods and different meanings of loss and transformation. It is a very, very deeply touching episode. I'm really sure you will enjoy everything that Laurel has to share. So let's go in and dive into an episode with Laurel.
But before we dive into this conversation, here's your reminder: hit that subscribe button, because we do want to have conversations like the one that we have today, where the topic is a really important topic and we need to have the reach to enable reach more people. So the more people who subscribe to the channel, we get further reach. So please hit that button, subscribe, and let's get this episode out to as many people as we can. Now, let's get on with this really wonderful conversation with Laurel.
Hi, Laurel. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, Lenka and Natalie. It's great to be here. I'm doing well, thanks.
So excited to have you here. It's taken us a while to make this happen, and I'm so glad that you actually came recommended from another guest that we had on the show, and that kind of gave us a little bit of maybe perspective on what we can talk about. But before we dive in, please let us and our listeners tell us a little bit more about yourself, who you are, what you do, and what brings you the spark, the fire every day in the morning into your life to do what you do.
Okay, that's a big question. I will try to answer it concisely. The best way to describe who I am is I'm somebody who's been through, like a lot of us, a lot of different chapters in my life, a lot of different journeys. So I professionally was a lawyer. I was a public interest lawyer for 20 years. I did public interest environmental law. And what drove me in that chapter of my life and my career was, which I think is the through line to what I do today, is this really deep quest for the truth, almost like a detective. I can also explain it in terms of astrology because I've gone from being a lawyer to a coach who is a self-taught astrologer and an intuitive astrologer. And so I'm a big Scorpio gal. I've got 4 planets in Scorpio. So I'm here to learn about myself and life through transformation and through some of the most intense transitions and transformation we can go through. So I have been a trained lawyer. I'm now a grief guide, is what I like to call myself. I'm professional speaker, but also coach and mentor for people going through grief and loss and transition. And what I've learned in my own life, having gone through both professional and personal number of transitions, is that it's in those in-between moments in life, and when all the uncertainty is surrounding us, that we have the opportunity to make the most profound transformation, both for ourselves and for others. But it is extremely uncomfortable and honestly quite scary. I would say that for most of my life, I've walked around with a lot of fear inside of me and not even knowing that that's what's propelled me to make a lot of the decisions that I've made in life. And it's only now in the latest chapter of my life, in the last 3 years, tragically, I lost my 18-year-old son 3 years ago to suicide. And it's been through that, profound grief journey that I feel like understood precisely why I'm here. And it is to use all that I've been through to help others who are going through any kind of loss or transition in their life.
Oh my gosh, that's a big one. So sorry to hear that, those kind of moments in life that those really shake you up and they make you question everything. I went through something similar a couple years ago, where my dad passed away through suicide. So it's a different, obviously different perspective, but it's still very close family member happening,
Absolutely.
and then you need to recover. But when you were talking about, you said that you're a grief guide, and it got me thinking if you could talk a little bit more about what grief guide means to you and how you help people, because we know that grief comes from possibly some trauma, some big or minor events, things happening. We have some emotions that we need to deal with, and we often will think that, okay, if I've been through something like this, someone in my life has passed away, I've made some major loss, I've been through some trauma, I need the therapy, I need counseling. So some people will often go to more traditional support systems, which is wonderful. Where then your support, specifically with the grief guidance, where does it fit into the matrix, into the mix of support people might be seeking? Why is it different? Why this angle attracted you? So could you walk us a little bit more through what does it mean in your experience and in your perspective to be a grief guide?
Yes. So there was a lot in your question, and I love that because I like lots of moving parts. So what I would say is that I'm sort of on a mission. I've also called myself a grief advocate, which of course ties with being the lawyer. That I'm on a mission to normalize grief in the world, in our life. I mean, it is part of life, and especially in the Western world, it is not accepted. And so what I found, which is a place I found myself a lot in life, was very alone and very lonely and very overwhelmed. And it's a terrible place to be. I mean, it's one of the hardest, if not the hardest. And we live in a society that is very disconnected anyways because of technology and everything. And so if you add on to that, then going through one of the most profound losses that you'll go through, it's enough to take anybody out. And my way of going through life was always kind of DIY it, for lots of reasons. Growing up with two parents who themselves grew up with trauma, I sort of learned to contain my emotions and to be very capable and strong and to give that outward appearance. But I also, of course, like all of us, had a deeply, deeply sensitive part of myself that I'm really honestly only now in this stage of my life beginning to integrate, we'll say, and to not kind of keep it separate. And so in the early stages of my grief, I felt utterly alone and literally didn't know how to share my feelings, which sounds weird because I'm a very introspective person and I can be very articulate about my feelings, but it's very different when you feel completely lost and overwhelmed in the fog of grief, which is how I felt. And so I'm hoping to both share with people that you don't have to go through it alone simply by sharing my story, because I think I'm somebody for whom everybody who knows me views me as an extremely capable and strong person. And yet I've even kind of not, I was hidden from myself, to be quite honest. And so there's this profound identity crisis that we go through when we go through loss. And you mentioned trauma. So I'll just briefly touch on that. You know, all trauma has grief, but not all grief has trauma. And what I discovered early on is that truly within 4 months of my son dying, within a week of him dying, this is a whole separate thing we can talk about. I learned that I had to have life-threatening surgery on my spinal column. They had discovered a benign tumor in my spinal column. And so I had layer upon layer. Then I had this sort of medical trauma. And so my body, and, there's a whole layer of health trauma that I went through. And so I literally needed to escape. So my older son goes to school in Ireland. My ex-husband was from Ireland. And I went to Dingle, Ireland, if anybody knows where that is. And the furthest westernmost point in Ireland, just to be alone. Like I needed to cocoon. Like my nervous system was just overwhelmed from carrying, honestly, this lifetime of sort of fear in this way of being. And trauma is anything that is too much too soon that overwhelms us. So trauma does not need to be, these big catastrophic things. It's just things that we weren't able to handle. And when I was alone, and gets back to the grief guide, because what I've done as a coach and as an astrologer is that I help people understand their story and their unique purpose for being here. Because when we do that, I believe that we can open up a gateway to self-compassion that maybe has been closed off for most of our life. And it's when we can kind of soften into that and soften into who we are and let go of the critical voice that is still there even during grief, you know. That's when some of the transformation can begin to happen, and when we give ourselves permission to slow down, to see life in a different way. Um, and so when I was in Dingle, and I'll sort of finish up my answer here, when I was in Dingle, I started to do this investigation because, as I said, I sort of have this investigative part of me of understanding that I was actually part of a cycle of grief. So, like, my father died 3 weeks before Patrick was born, suddenly. So 20 years ago. Patrick's father, my ex-husband, died 3 years before he was born. He was an alcoholic, and that very much affected Patrick. He very much was alone with his grief because COVID then came along, and he was isolated at home, and he was an empath and just the kindest, gentlest boy that you would ever meet. And so I realized, and he and I had this bond that, you know, we both carried grief. We carried grief over his father. I had unexpressed grief over losing my father because then I had a newborn to take care of, and Patrick was literally born to a grieving mother. And we know from epigenetics how we pass on, quite literally. You know, the emotional state of the mother is passed on, and the father, you know, from the time of conception. So we're inheriting all of that. And so it got me doing a deep dive into my own family history and my parents' history and understanding how far back that trauma went. And it really, not right away, but over time made me realize there's a cycle that we're all at some degree part of, and we don't even know it because we don't talk about these things in our families, you know, until maybe our children are adults. And how much kinder of a world could it be if we all understood more what we were carrying and didn't even know it? Because I understood then at a profound level that a lot of the fear and sadness I carried wasn't even my own, you know. It was sadness that I had been born into. And then when you layer the astrology into it, I understood that I was here to break that cycle, you know. Um, and so that's a little bit about what I mean by being a grief guide and how I've you really used under going deep into my own past. A lot of it is healing our past, of course, and grief gives us an opportunity to do that if we're open to it.
Wow, that really is a great way that you've explained it, and your journey. It's so powerful. And one of the things that you said was you went to Dingle, and I've been there. I know it's like at the end of the world, and you built this or created this cocoon around you because you just needed to find that place to almost be wounded and allow yourself to come out the other side. And one thing that you were saying is you created this, you had this cocoon, you were looking, or you found your way out, you know, through the different things that you were looking at. And we have a friend, and unfortunately, suicide is becoming more and more, it's happening more and more. So my question is, how can one find one's way out of it, or to help people that you know, our listeners might know, when you think, when somebody is in that place, because grief is something that we do have to find a way to live with. And there's different levels of it, but when you suppress it and when you don't go through it with medication, is how can you find your way through it? Because it's almost like it doesn't happen. It's not allowing your mind, your body, your emotions, or anything to go through this process.
Yeah.
So how can one almost not be medicated? I know that's not the right way to say the question.
No. I have deep empathy. The summer that Patrick died, I did go see a psychiatrist for the first time in my life who offered me some medication to help me sleep. And I was pretty desperate at the time, so I said okay to that. It didn't work for me. It didn't make me feel, I didn't like the way it made my body feel. And so I maybe tried it for like a month. But for people, we can't be in our grief all the time. So, what I say is sometimes denial or suppression is a form of grace that's offered to us. What I would say is that you need to be careful about staying there permanently in that suppressed state. For me, what happened is, yes, I went to Dingle and then I came back and we moved homes and I'm very good at keeping myself busy, which may not be medication, but it's another form of not feeling your feelings. And so what happened to me is I had this experience in Dingle, which I would say was profoundly grace-filled. And we can also talk about the ways that my son found to communicate with me because that brought a lot of grace into my life. But when we are shut down and suppressed, you're right, as a permanent state, then we can't feel it. And so what I would say to anybody is to I was trying to create safety in my life, I might, by cocooning. And I came to realize that was my MO a lot in life is to put a wall up or not, it was me or other people, but having the two coexist often together, integrated when I wasn't doing well was not always easy. And so I think you have to find a way, whether it's, being willing to go off the medication and have like create whatever your safety net is, whether it's a secure friend or to just say, I'm going to try this for a little bit. But no, what I will say to you is what I also realized is I've often felt numb during the most overwhelming periods of time in my life. And I literally didn't have the words for that until very recently. I started studying something called the gene keys, which is related to human design. And I found out that numbness is very much a part of one of my patterns. And numbness is a feeling though. And so that's another thing. And grief has no timeline. And also I would say to anybody like, as easy as it is, and I still do it myself, to not compare our griefs, to not either say mine is less or more or worse or, not because we're all different people and we all have different backgrounds and different lineages and different stories. And so we're going to all deal with it. And so that's one thing. Maybe it'll take your friend, 6 months to get off this medicine versus, maybe 6 weeks would be the ideal. But, I don't think there's anything wrong with being on medication if you need it, but to use that time to get a plan in place, hopefully your friend is in therapy, is able to talk. But if she's become so deadened, then yes, I would say that's where, that would be a concern because ultimately, for myself, it was like a zigzag pattern for the over 3 years of kind of going into numbness and sort of being busy with my life and not really directly addressing it. But even I was talking to my mom and she said, but I don't think you were overly busy. And I was like, well, sometimes I wasn't, but sometimes I felt like I was. But I realized it was all okay. It's what I needed to do to get through it. But I don't know if your friend, if somebody has to go to work or care for small children or, these kinds of demands of life, I was very fortunate in a sense that I had a flexibility in my daily schedule. And I kept thinking all the time, I was always grateful if I had to get up and go into an office or just to be performing every day in a workspace, I might have needed medication too. I don't know. Um, so that's my answer to that.
And I think that that's important. Like you said, it's having that temporary space to give yourself, whether it's going to the end of the world in Dingle or just being busy and finding that space. But there's still that flow to it. And I do get that sometimes you just need to have that numbingness to help you to then do the next thing, all those busy moments. And as you said, there was a sort of the zigzag, but there's movement in it. And like I said, everybody's different. You don't just sit down, deal with the grief, have a good cry. Okay, now it's sorted. It does have its ups and downs, and some days are better than others. Some days, even years later, it's like, oh my God, okay, it's one of those days. But the thing is, it's having that movement. And I think that's what's important with grief, and whether it's through losing somebody close, or through losing a job, or through anything. And I mean, at the moment, my life is in the process of leaving the UK to move back to South Africa. And there are moments of grief in that, because I'm saying goodbye to friends who I know we can stay in contact on Zoom, but you're still saying goodbye to that, sitting and having a coffee with them. There's just, routines that we have, little things. It's like, oh, there's those moments of grief. Grief is a death, but grief is also a loss of something.
Well, I like to say that grief is any change we didn't want. If you want to define it at its broadest level, and you were saying that we can have sort of micro grief, and then we can have large grief. And moving is absolutely a grief. And what I like to do, one of the things I like to do is try to reframe or change the perspective on things. It's something I did when I was a lawyer, and then when I was coaching and consulting. And so every ending is a new beginning. And just going back to your friend and that example that you were sharing about the profound grief and the sort of stuckness or ability to move beyond being on the medication, we have a choice when we're faced with sort of the worst that we can imagine in life, is that we can either allow that to overcome us, or we need to grow our life bigger, because our grief is never going to be smaller. And so that is something that I heard early on. And between understanding that this is literally about survival, like if I were to just kind of curl up in a ball, then that could be the end of my life, so to speak. But what I did, and truly this has been the lifeline, and for anybody who's listening who's lost somebody that's so dear to them, is like, what would they want for you? They're here with us, like Patrick is right here. I'm in touch with him all the time. And whether you believe that or not, I know that we have a choice. And how do we find a purpose? I don't mean a purpose in the death, but a purpose in the life of the person that we lost. And how can we channel that? Because if we can't do it for ourselves, maybe we can tap into that profound love, because grief is love with nowhere to go. That's also what grief is. And so if you can ask yourself, this is what we need to do sometimes in the depths of our despair, like, how do I get through this day? What would my loved one want from me? What can I do with that love? And that's sort of when I would find myself in these periods of numbness, I would say, I know this. And I knew this because Patrick found ways to communicate with me. I only sought a medium out once, but he literally got messages to me. And I know that he wanted me to be happy. And I know that he wanted me to, help other people. And the way that I knew how to do that was by deepening that connection that I felt to him. And so probably in the second year, I decided to become a grief educator, because I like to learn. And, my part of my grief journey for me has been integrating the head and the heart. I'm very much somebody who's lived in her head a lot of her life and relied upon my sort of intellectual power. But I was disconnected a lot of the time from what's down here because it was just too scary, right? And so I took this grief educator course through David Kessler. I started to learn about it. That felt really empowering. It made me start to feel a little bit more secure and like I can use this information. I can use my background. I can start to integrate these chapters of my life that I couldn't quite figure out how did all this fit together. And I did something, and I'm sharing this again as an example because I want to go back to your friend who's stuck. And we don't need to do it. We can do it in small ways, but how can you honor that person? And so my husband and I decided on what would have been Patrick's 20th birthday. I could not, there's no way I could have done it the first year, but the second year we did a memorial hike and a memorial walk in our community, and we raised about $20,000 to support kids going through grief. And we did it again this year. And I have to tell you, that was about one of the most scary things I ever did, is to appear in public and publicly speak and be messy and talk about how I didn't know who I was and, That was not something that was comfortable for me to do. And yet, at my deepest level, I knew that if I didn't do that, I was going to be stuck in sort of in this walled off space for potentially the rest of my life. And that I was being offered, and I can only say this now, 3 years into it, potentially one of the most beautiful gifts that I could have ever imagined, which is the gift of sort of my whole self, you know, of taking all these pieces of myself that kind of felt like this puzzle that didn't fit together and find a new way. They don't go back together. We're not the same person, you know, when we go through something catastrophic or even, you know, we become a different person, but only if we're open. And so we can talk about spirituality and grace and all of that, but and our loved ones, but I truly had to kind of start tapping into something behind besides just our head. Because if we stay in our head and try to get through grief, it doesn't work.
And this is a great point that you're making, is the getting out of your own head. Because for me, one of the most powerful lessons was to realize that you can't think yourself out of anxiety, out of depression, out of grief, out of all of these things. You cannot think yourself out of it. You cannot learn by studying and reading and listening to podcasts and intellectualizing and, you know, overcomplicate. Like, we cannot do it with, as you said, with our logical, conscious thinking mind. We need to bring in our heart, we need to bring in our gut, we need to bring in our body. And I'm always curious to know what tools and tips and strategies people use to allow them to step away from the thinking mind, because it's easy to say, oh, stop thinking, you know, go meditate and get into the body, be grounded, feel embodied, all these kind of fancy words that are becoming a lot more popular. But how do you do it in practice? And we have this ongoing conversation with Natalie where she's not really into traditional meditation, like sit down, be zen, have your mind clear. And we're always looking for ways to help people to get away from the thinking mind, to overcome the inner chatter, to be able to connect with the body and understand what we're feeling and how the nervous system works and what is it telling us. Do you have any tips or any strategies, any methods that you use to help you reconnect?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I would say, well, I've probably been meditating for, I don't know, for 13 or 14 years. I To me, meditating is nothing more than allowing ourselves to sit still. If we can let go of all of the shoulds, you know, and what it needs to look like and all of that, if you can just allow yourself to sit still for 5 minutes a day, I think that's a huge victory. And maybe it goes beyond that, but maybe it doesn't. And you just learn to be alone with your thoughts. I think we need to let go of some of all of like the heaviness of what we think meditation looks like, because I am not a perfect meditator by any means. But what I found is when I've allowed myself quiet and stillness, which is something I was even starting to do before I lost my son. I just realized for my own sanity, I needed to slow my life way down. And that made me enjoy my own company. I think for some people, just even being alone with themselves is uncomfortable. Um, and that can look like different things. I will say the other thing is I am not somebody who while I'm very physical, I'm still learning how to have that relationship sort of with my body. And I sort of would scoff at yoga and somatic stuff. And I honestly look back now and I think part of the reason I had this health trauma at the same time as losing my son, because I really felt like God hated me, you know, like I was really like, seriously. Um, I think it was to force me to listen to my body because I'm literally just coming out of 3 years of lots of like, you know, I've never been somebody who had digestive issues. And it took me the better part of a year to realize, oh, yeah, that's connected to grief. Grief literally interrupts our body, literally, and we are digesting our emotions, like that whole mind body connection that maybe I'd read about for years. Even when I was going through it, it took me time to realize it. And you know, this might be kind of, you know, funny, haha, but for me, the mind body connection did come through learning. Like I started, I used sort of a lot of mystical, spiritual tools in my practice, and I started learning about myself. And literally, one of the messages when I read about the gene keys was I needed to learn to like breathe. And I was like, what are you talking about? Breathe. Oh, right. Yeah, you still need to slow down. And so it doesn't happen overnight. I'm not a person, I like, I don't mind yoga. Like yin yoga where you just get to like, but and so I think it can happen for all of us. Be in nature. If you can't meditate, can you put your feet in the grass for 5 minutes a day? Like letting go of being so hard on ourselves that I'm not doing it right. Because we are all our own best guides if we can listen to that intuitive voice, and we all have it. It's just that it gets drowned out for the busyness of life. And then again, that's another piece of the grief journey for me, is it put me in an even deeper way in touch with that intuitive voice inside myself that just kind of trusted the next right thing to appear in front of me. Because I didn't always trust my body. I mean, the honest truth is like I trusted my mind, but I didn't always trust my body. And so I was somebody who did CrossFit and half marathons and all these things in the past. And I thought, oh, like I'm strong. No, I was just kind of like disconnected, and doing the thing. Um, Probably trying to outrun fear, honestly, kind of from more of that anxious state. Um, so again, it's sort of it's a process, but I would say that slowing down. I mean, of course, like eating, trying to like think of being loving towards your body and eating well. And I definitely went through my own share of like, having, like, and so I'm not saying this happens overnight because I'm somebody who's, 3 years realizing like, yeah, I probably had a little too much wine and too much food because that I became my comfort place, or, but we all get there when we're ready to.
It's so interesting that you said you didn't trust your body, you trusted your mind. Because the connection to, again, being able to listen and understand and decipher what our body is trying to communicate and trust it. And this is another common theme that we often tap on. It's the listening within, and I love the way you put it, the trusting with it. We can listen within and we can feel, what our body is trying to tell us. We have a little bit of a pain here, we have a little bit of an ache here, we have some discomfort here. We may be feeling what the body is telling us, but then we still tend to rationalize it, to be like, well, it's maybe the running that I've been doing, or maybe the mattress that I have at home, or maybe I pulled something. So we look at it very practically from the physiological perspective, rather than seeing it for something deeper, something that is more psychological, that is more, psychosomatic, that can be the emotions talking to us in a different way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was going to just say that for me, I've had to learn this the very hard way, because for 10 years, I mean, as far as I can know, I had a 3-inch cyst in my back that was creating tremendous pressure on my spinal column, and it had been there for at least a decade. And I was pushing myself to do all kinds of things, CrossFit, where I was like trying to do these crazy things, and I was always in pain. And I just thought, this is a thing. Oh, I endure. That's what life is. It's pain, and I'm just going to get through it. And it was really only until right before 4 months before my son died that I was in a workout class with a friend, and she's like, I do the same thing as you, and I'm not in this much pain. Would you please go have somebody like take a scan of your back or whatever? Because I was always having these back pains. And if she hadn't said that to me, I don't know what, but then I did do that. And what was happening is, talk about numbness. My legs were starting to go numb. And I was getting to the point where like I couldn't walk more than a mile. So this is what it took for me to finally like, and I'm saying this to you now, literally that expression, trust your body. I recently returned to weightlifting, and people always tell me, oh, you're so strong, you're so strong. And they want to push me. And I'm always like, stop, like I've been through enough. And then I said, Laurel, you know what? Trust your body. Like talk to it while you're lifting these weights. Cause I still inside would be like, I don't know if I could do this. And so that literally is in the past month where I was like, okay, body, we got this. Like we're all going to work together while we do this deadlift here. Like all of us, it's not just your leg muscles. And so like, this is a new thing to me. And, I would hang out with all these like Virgos and other people who are very deeply connected to their bodies and stuff. And I was like, I don't know, I don't get this, but yeah, okay, I know I'm strong. But now I'm starting to trust it and feel it and integrate it. So it's a new journey for me, that part.
Just seeing your smile when you're talking about the weightlifting, it looks like, just by your facial expression that you actually enjoy it. Now that you're getting into the trusting yourself and trusting your body and working all of you together. So thank you. It just lit up your face when you were talking about that. So, but one question I wanted to ask you is, majority of people are brought up to avoid emotions. I mean, as women is it that time of the month again? Don't be so emotional. Oh, just why are you crying? It's nothing. We get all these comments, told us it's buck up, be strong, boys don't cry and you're a sissy if you cry, all these things. So we are taught from a very young age to almost suppress our emotions and to not connect with them, not feel them, because when we are trying to hide them, we don't necessarily feel them or work through them. And as a grief guide, but also just through your journey, is how can people start to find ways to connect with their emotions? Because when you are not used to your emotions, they can feel really scary. And I'm not talking about the big kick in the butt emotions like that grief, but just joy or sadness or happiness or overwhelm. And there's hundreds of other emotions in that, but they can feel really overwhelming and complicated. And then how do you differentiate between these different emotions? Because we've almost put 100 emotions into 3, and do they fit into those 3 slots? But those 3 slots break down into a lot of different ones, and it's finding ways to really learn to connect with them. And it's like, okay, is this anger, or is it frustration, or is it overwhelm? What are my feelings? So if you can just share maybe some tools that you used or that you use with clients, but it's reconnecting with emotions.
Yes. Oh goodness. And this question really resonates with me because I was saying earlier, I definitely, I am the youngest. I had 3 older brothers. I was raised by a very sort of conflict avoidant mother, father, both, had, alcoholism in their family of origin. And so the message I grew up with, was that my feelings were too much. And I was also, and I was strong. And so I suppressed the feelings and I relied upon the strength. And so what I would say to people is all of the wisdom is in our heart. So I like to kind of come at things first from sort of a motivational, like, okay, what am I going to get out of it? Why would I do this? So if we can really trust that this is where our strength lies, is the wisdom and the intuition, it comes from our heart. And we've been sold a bill of goods for all of us for, that this is where, how we get ahead in life. This is where everything comes from. And so you guys are doing, your mission here is to dissuade people of that. But literally, you're right. People don't often, especially, and I know I'm not going to say especially men, because, I've always been articulate about my feelings, so that part is a little harder for me, but I'm definitely married to somebody who's recently, as we've been on this grief journey, had to learn. And one of the things that I came upon in my grief educator class and that his therapist gave to him is literally like a feelings wheel, And so, you can get these online or whatever, because for most of us, we're happy, mad, sad, glad, like we don't know what those deeper feelings are. And so sometimes it is quite as simple as like, not being afraid, but honestly, it probably is, whether it's a friend or a therapist or somebody, I think if we're just kind of in it by ourselves trying to figure it out, it's, I think, through relationship that we can often have, and it can be messy and imperfect. And if you have somebody safe and close, whether it's a partner, a friend, a therapist, a colleague, whatever, that you can give yourself permission to be vulnerable. I think at the heart of it, this is all Brene Brown's work, right? It's like we're afraid. We're afraid of being rejected. We're afraid of not belonging. We're afraid of being wrong. And so, if we can kind of reframe that, and realize that that's actually our superpower. I mean, I had this experience. I went on a grief retreat in March with my husband, and there was this medicine wheel ceremony. And it was a moment for me of realizing all of the different ways and as much work as I had done. So my answer to this is it's not a one and done. It doesn't happen overnight. Take baby steps. But I think that it's hard to do on your own, to if you're really somebody who's not in touch with their feelings. I still love, like, I think nature connects us to our feelings. Bring a journal, there's something called expressive writing. If you look up James Pennebaker, there's a methodology where if you can, there's a guided methodology where you can practice this, because it's often safe to write your feelings down. Maybe you're somebody who doesn't want to express them, but that's another tool that I would say. So this grief retreat, the medicine circle, you had to pick a rock. I picked a rock, and then they come and tell you, the guide comes and tells you what it was. And I was shocked when he came up to me, and he said, grizzly bear. And I was like, grizzly bear. And immediately, because of the old programming, I start going, oh, those are people are afraid of, they're angry, they're scary, they hurt people, like they're, whoa. And what he said to me, and it was like one of the most profound moments I've had on this grief journey, is whenever I see a lone woman on that rock, I know they are a fierce protector. And grizzly bears are actually deeply intuitive. And I ended up, I write on Substack under Lost and Found, and I ended up writing about that experience because it showed me how I had subverted this idea of strength. And actually, my strength was my emotions. I thought my strength was kind of like muscling up and, using my head and all this. And I write about it on the Substack, but like it was this profound moment of integration for me to realize that my strength was actually my feelings and that heart of mine. And it's why, I mean, for any mother who loses a child, but that sense of who am I now that I don't have my youngest cub to protect anymore? And it named the loss because I have felt so stuck in trying to figure out my way back, professionally and personally, because I do have this like toughness, but it comes from my heart, not my head. And I love helping people, but also that need to, whether it was protecting my two sons when I was a single mom, growing up with a dysfunctional, husband or whatever, that, or being the lawyer in the David to Goliath, that outlet, it's like, what do I do with this, So I realize it's a very roundabout way, but that was my own experience of thinking that I had knew all my feelings, and it was a profound moment of like my identity kind of coming into coherence for me because I was still very confused, and this was in March, of like, who am I now, how do I find my way? And I think I found the answer to that. So
thank you for sharing that. And it's also it's giving permission for people to feel their feelings and to embrace them, because your emotions are part of who you are. They are a way that you can connect with yourself and listening to your heart. I mean, we've had a speaker, Teresa Palmer, who spoke about the heart, the first brain, and how to listen to your heart. And emotions come from the heart. They don't come from the brain. I mean, we analyze the emotions in the brain and we shush them up, or we say that's not good enough, but we don't feel we feel our emotions in our heart, but we think our emotions through the brain. And we've had a variety of guests, and including yourself, who it's almost like saying emotions are okay, is find your way through them. And you mentioned Brené Brown. I mean, Lenka and I are a huge fan. I think each of us have read all her books, and including the Atlas from the Heart, which is about all the emotions. And it's a really good book because it explains for thinkers and brain people and intellects. It's a great way to differentiate between the different emotions and to have an understanding to help to feel them, to know what is it that I'm feeling. So it's a really good book to get an understanding of emotions, because sometimes emotions can feel, what the hell's just happened to me? What is this? And we do need our brain. We do need the communication between the two, but it's having that connection. It's not one or the other, but it's finding that connection and that trust in yourself. And I think that's also something that you were saying, is trusting what the emotion is, where's it coming from, and even flipping it. Because sometimes we have this idea of something, but if we look at it at a different way, it can open up a new avenue or a new door on understanding of what it is that we're going through or feeling or connecting with. And so thank you for really, sharing that and giving our listeners permission to feel themselves and feel their emotions.
Absolutely. And the trust point is so huge because we are taught, and I certainly was in this category, most of our world is externalized. So we trust all these things outside of ourselves, whether it's people or job titles or money or the things or whatever. We put all our trust in these things outside of ourselves. And when we go through loss, I do think it's almost like the universe's way of bringing you back inside, and saying, no, 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 like trust yourself. I mean, if, I don't, I believe God lives inside of all of us, the universe, our higher selves. It's in here. It's in here. It's not out there. And so if we can tell ourselves that enough, that I am my own best guide, that I have my wisdom, and that I am divinely connected to something larger than myself, then that's when life can really start to shift. And the other thing I would say about kind of the feelings, we can't selectively numb our feelings, right? I mean, this is what Brene Brown talks about. If we numb the pain, we numb the joy. And so we flatline our way through life. And I am somebody who realized, I think I was probably in my mid to late 30s with two young kids, and I started going, where's the joy? I remember that feeling of joy as a kid, or like, and the summers would come in. And it's something that kind of stayed with me for like literally the next 20 years of my life. Like, joy started to be this fleeting thing in my life, and I started to view life as this thing to endure, this thing to get through, this thing that's hard. And that's just the way that it is when we go through middle age or have kids. And that's just the way it is. And I'm here to say that it's not. And if there's anything I could go back and tell myself, at that age, was just like, don't shut it down. If you're getting messages from your family or other people that you're too much or that's too much or it's not, I would have conflicts with bosses, with, my partners, with every message I ever got in my life was, you're too much, your feelings are too much. And so I understand at a really profound, and I would shut them down and I would live up here. And so it's really been one of the most profound gifts of this grief journey, is to understand actually not. And I remember I would, back when I started getting into astrology, I would start seeing this like the sort of almost like oracle of like, you're here to like, to do the opposite of what you're kind of doing now. And I was like, what? I don't want to do that. I don't want to be messy. I don't want to go out there and share about all of my struggles. And I remember literally like 6 or 7, this was before my son even passed away. And I was like, no, I don't think so. No, I'm good being, because when we're in our head, we're in control. That's the other reason we don't want to feel our emotions, is it's scary because, and so I'm very much somebody who understands wanting to control life, and when we control, again, it's like the numbing. When we control life, like that isn't really life, and we are shutting ourselves off from the possibilities that might exist if we can just let go, trust ourselves, trust our, higher power, know that you are being, held, and you are part of something much larger than even, in that moment, that pain that you're going through.
That is huge, trust. So, so thank you for sharing. And I'm really glad that you are coming out and trusting yourself and being all the messy, because I think this is what we need is the messy to help to show us that we are messy, we're human beings, and it's not all nice little compartment boxes that you can just slot yourself in. So it's enjoy the mess and just have fun with the mess and trust. So thank you so much for sharing that. So this is where we ask, Laurel, can we please have your gold nuggets?
Yes, and I think it kind of follows from what I was just talking about. There's this quote that I love from Ram Dass, who was the 60s spiritual writer, philosopher, that we're all just here walking each other home. And to me, home is in the heart. It's where we belong. And home is also where love is. And so if I can remember that when I'm in pain or when I'm missing my loved one or when I'm grieving, that I'm loving, and that I'm coming home. And that if I am coming home, there are others coming home. And that if we can learn to not be alone, instead of trying to overthink, like, what am I feeling or whatever, that simpleness of the interconnectedness, that we're all here to just walk each other home. And if I see somebody struggling, whether I know them or not, just to give them a smile or to, acknowledge, we all just want to be seen. And if we can do that with the grace and the love of the loved one that we've lost behind us and view them as like shining their light on us, then maybe that's the first step out of the despair, out of the numbness, out of the just the hopelessness, the overwhelm, the feeling alone, the not knowing who I am. There's so many aspects to loss to navigate our way through. But I truly think this thing about the heart, and viewing that as our superpower and not being so afraid of it, that's the gold nugget that I'll share.
Well, we love our gold nuggets because we get some real doozies of a gold nuggets, and that was really powerful and beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing that quote with us. Now, for our listeners who they've enjoyed what they've been listening to, and they think, oh, I need more of Laurel. I need to find out more about grief guidance, or I want to learn more about how to help a loved one through grief, or I'm going through grief. Where can people find you?
So the best place is, as I said earlier, on Substack. You can find me under Laurel O'Sullivan. Lost and Found is what I write about, issues around grief and identity and all the things we've talked about today. But also my website, laurelosullivan.com, has ways for how you can get in touch with me if you're looking for a grief guide or mentor.
And of course, all the links that you've shared with us, we will make sure they will be added in the description below so people can easily click and find you either on social media or visit your website, read your blog. Thank you so much for being here. I genuinely enjoyed learning more about your journey and your perspective, and it was so helpful and impactful. But here in the podcast, we always want to squeeze a little bit more, a little extra from our guest. We're always sneaking in one last question, and because the mission on the podcast is to kind of find ways to have more life in one's life, to find ways to lean more into life. I'm always curious, what gives you life?
I would say it's the mystery of life is what gives me life. Is I have this insatiable curiosity. I always told my kids that if there's nothing else in life, be curious. And so that honestly, in my darkest hours, would propel me. It was like, I want to know more. I want to understand more. I believe that there's more here. What am I learning? Like I look at life as sort of a laboratory, because we didn't necessarily sign up. I mean, we did sign up for it, right? But we're here. And so how do we make the most out of it? And I think we have a choice, we have a choice how we go through life, and we get one precious life, as Mary Oliver says, and what are you going to do with it? And so that combination of sort of curiosity and leaning into the unknown, as much as I said, I'm a recovering, like I've always tried to control life, and we're not necessarily in the driver's seat. And so that's what I would say.
Wow, mystery and curiosity are those just beautiful words. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you for sharing your time with us today and your journey and being vulnerable on our podcast and just sharing the journey that you've been through and how you found your way, because journeys are great stories, and stories help people to find their own way. And even though it's your journey, but I'm sure that our listeners will get something from it. So thank you so much for your energy, your wisdom and guidance today. So we really appreciate you in your morning and our afternoon. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
And for our listeners, what have you got from today? It was quite a deep topic, and grief is not something that is spoken about, which needs to be spoken about more. And we would love to know, what did you get from this episode? What aha moments or little nuggets connected with you? And have you experienced a grief, and how did you, or what worked for you to find your way of dealing with it? We would love to know your stories. But until next time, talk to you soon. Bye.